Welcome everyone. Thank you for joining me today. This is the account with the news summary for day 383 of the war in Ukraine. Today I have one disinformation campaign warning as well as one short extra segment regarding the deteriorating relationship between Ukraine and the Georgian government. All other updates are grouped into the usual situation inside Ukraine, including an update on a renewed curfew in Kherson Oblast due to Russian infiltration, the occupied territories, with an update regarding Russia hiring migrants to work in the occupied territories, Russia and Belarus, containing a very interesting article about how Russia is cutting down the forests in Moscow to make space for air defense systems, and the international developments, including an update on the execution of Alexander Matsievsky and the Leopard 2 training for Ukrainian soldiers. And now for the disinformation campaign warning. Russia has launched an anti-Ukraine campaign on Facebook, spreading fakes about the battles for Bakhmut and the supposed reduction of military aid from the West. The Center for Strategic Communications and Information Security under the Ministry of Culture explained how to spot the Russian fakes on social media. The main messages of the campaign are: the battle for Bakhmut has already been allegedly lost by Ukraine. They allegedly do not believe in Ukraine in the West. The command of the defense forces ran away and the boys are fighting back on their own. The US is allegedly reducing the supply of weapons because it caught the Ukrainian authorities stealing supplies. Moving on to the flashpoints along the front. Bakhmut. The northwest remains critical for Ukraine. Russia managed to make small progress here. In the south, the situation continues to be at a stalemate. The commander of the Ukrainian ground forces, Alexander Syrsky, has reported that the situation around Bakhmut in Donetsk Oblast is challenging. The occupiers keep trying to break through the defenses and advance into the city center, but are suffering heavy losses. Avdiivka. There is still no proper confirmation on the Krasnohorivka situation north of Avdiivka. Ukrainian sources reported fighting in and around Krasnohorivka and a stalled Russian momentum. Personally, I continue to suspect the settlement is contested for now. A similar situation is unfolding in Kamianka. Fighting is reported in and around the settlement. And to start the news segment, the updates on the souring relationship between Ukraine and Georgia. The Prime Minister of Georgia, Irakli Garibashvili, called on Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky and other Ukrainian politicians to refrain from interfering in his country's internal affairs. He criticized Zelensky for the fact that he supported the participants of the protests against the law on foreign agents. When a person who is fighting comes out in response to a destructive action carried out by several thousand people here in Georgia, this is direct evidence that this person is involved, motivated to make something happen here. Klitschko came out, Fagin came out, some unknown people came out, Ukrainian politicians, Arachamia, and some dirty losers who say that changes are needed, a coup, which is a direct intervention, the Prime Minister of Georgia said. Ole Nikolenko, spokesperson of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Ukraine, responded to the interference allegations by saying, almost verbatim repeating the thesis of Russian propaganda, the representatives of the Georgian authorities accused Ukraine of preparing a coup d'etat in Georgia, drawing it into a war with Russia, sending forces to incite a civil war. We flatly reject such insinuations that have nothing to do with reality. That's not the right place for the Georgian authorities to look for an enemy. The head of the Servant of the People Party, David Arachamia, meanwhile stated, the Prime Minister of Georgia stated indignantly that allegedly Ukrainian politicians are interfering in Georgia's internal affairs. I think the whole world understands that the preservation of democracy in Georgia, whose government is filled with Russian agents, is a key task of the entire world community. A look at all the minor updates out of Ukraine. Power outages have been reported in Kyiv and 4 other oblasts. This is still part of the aftermath of Russia's missile attack during the night of March 8th to 9th. According to a survey, 64% of Ukrainians are convinced that it is necessary to try to liberate the entire territory of Ukraine, including Crimea, even if it means a more prolonged war and less support from the West. As a result of military assistance provided by the US and European countries, following the full-scale Russian invasion in February last year, Ukraine became the world's third largest arms importer in 2022. Oleksandr Prokudin, the head of the Kherson military administration, announced that a new 5-day curfew is being introduced in Kherson Oblast in connection with a possible infiltration by Russian sabotage and reconnaissance groups. Next up, the latest regarding the situation in the occupied territories. Russian companies have hired hundreds of migrants from Central Asia to work in the Russian-occupied territories of Ukraine, in particular collecting the bodies of the occupiers killed. Members of the Wagner PMC started to recruit locals in the occupied city of Melitopol to make them participate in battles for the city of Bakhmut. The occupation authorities in the temporarily occupied territories of the Zaporizhzhia Oblast plan to cancel mandatory learning of the Ukrainian language in the new school year. Moving on to the news updates from Russia and Belarus. According to the press secretary of the President of the Russian Federation, Dmitry Peskov, the Kremlin is currently convinced that it is impossible to negotiate any peace agreement with Ukraine and that Russia's goals can only be achieved through military means. Russia has deployed 3 missile carriers with a total salvo of 20 missiles in the Black Sea. The president of Belarus, Alexander Lukashenko, has arrived in Tehran, Iran, to meet with Iranian leaders. Lukashenko and Iranian President Ebrahim Raisi will reportedly discuss the country's bilateral relations with an emphasis on trade and economic cooperation, including industry, agriculture, transport, and logistics. A draft law to raise the conscription age from 18 to 21 and 27 to 30 was presented to the Duma. It is noteworthy that the bill allows young adults to volunteer for the army even before the military age. Authorities in Moscow have begun cutting down forests to deploy air defense systems in the Russian capital. As the news agency states, active deforestation started after the New Year in several districts of Moscow. S-400 anti-aircraft missile systems have been deployed in Losiny Ostrov National Park and on the research grounds of the Timi-Ryazev Agricultural Academy. About 100 hectares of forest were cut down in the protected zone of the Kolomenskoye Museum Reserve in the Pechatniki district of the city for the needs of the Russian military. And to wrap up the news segment, the international developments. According to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and European Integration of Moldova, Alexander Matsievsky, the soldier of the Territorial Defense Forces of Chernihiv Oblast, who was executed in Russian captivity, had Moldovan citizenship. The ministry condemned the execution harshly, adding that his execution could be qualified as a war crime and a gross violation of international humanitarian law. The European Commission will give the first evaluation of Ukraine's progress in fulfilling the EU's candidate criteria in May, by which Kyiv will finish the implementation of most of the conditions, Deputy Prime Minister for European and Euro-Atlantic Integration Olha Stefanishina said. The International Criminal Court plans to open 2 cases investigating war crimes conducted by Russian forces against Ukraine. Arrest warrants will be sought for several individuals, according to current and former officials. The Chinese President Xi Jinping plans to visit Russia for a meeting with his Russian counterpart Vladimir Putin as early as next week. Xi Jinping plans to speak with President Volodymyr Zelensky after the meeting. The first 10 Ukrainian military crews who will use Leopard 2A4 battle tanks in their country against Russia have completed the 4 weeks of training at the National Training Center in Zaragoza, Spain. Additionally, it was reported that Ukrainians who arrived in Germany for operational training on the Leopard 2 main battle tanks have completed their training here as well. U.S. Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin announced that the next meeting in the Rammstein format will take place on March 15th. Today, Austin and Resnikov discussed the priorities of the contact group. And now for the intelligence report segment, starting as usual with the UK Ministry of Defense. In recent weeks, Wagner Group owner Yevgeny Prigozhin has likely lost access to recruiting in Russian prisons due to his ongoing disputes with the Russian Ministry of Defense leadership. Prigozhin is highly likely pivoting recruitment efforts towards free Russian citizens. Since the start of March 2023, Wagner has set up outreach teams based in sports centers in at least 40 locations across Russia. In recent days, masked Wagner recruiters also gave career talks in Moscow high schools, distributing questionnaires entitled "Application of a Young Warrior" to collect the contact details of interested pupils. About half of the prisoners Wagner has already deployed in Ukraine have likely become casualties, and the new initiatives are unlikely to make up for the loss of the convict recruit pipeline. If the ban endures, Prigozhin will likely be forced to reduce the scale or intensity of Wagner operations in Ukraine. A look at the latest assessment by the Institute for the Study of War. ISW is publishing an abbreviated campaign update today, March 12th. This report establishes a comprehensive timeline of the rivalry between Wagner Group financier Yevgeny Prigozhin and the Russian Ministry of Defense, MOD, which likely reached a boiling point over Bakhmut. The report also analyzes the Russian MOD's likely intent to expand Wagner forces in Bakhmut and explores Russian President Vladimir Putin's manipulation of this conflict to maintain the stability of his regime. The Institute reported that the Russian Ministry of Defense is likely seizing the opportunity to deliberately expand both elite and convict Wagner forces in Bakhmut. The analysts noted that the Ministry of Defense of the Russian Federation is increasingly limiting Prigozhin's ability to recruit convicts and obtain ammunition, forcing him to publicly admit his dependence on Shoigu and Gerasimov. Prigozhin threatened to withdraw Wagner forces from Bakhmut and hinted that the Ministry of Defense of the Russian Federation used the PMC for assault operations with high attrition to preserve the forces of Russia's regular army. The researchers believe that the Wagner PMC had to use its elite forces to maintain offensive momentum in Bakhmut, but that these forces could be exhausted in direct attacks on the eastern, southern, and northern parts of Bakhmut. The Kremlin's alleged strategy to expand Wagner forces in the battle for Bakhmut comes after Prigozhin started a relentless defamation campaign against the Russian MOD in May 2022, which focused on Russia's failures during the Ukrainian counteroffensive in Kharkiv and Donetsk oblasts and the mobilization in the fall. Russian President Vladimir Putin has probably not yet decided whether he will spare Prigozhin, and Wagner's fate likely depends on Prigozhin's ability to convince the Kremlin of his loyalty. The fall of Prigozhin will most likely frighten other Kremlin officials such as Kadyrov and force them to curb their ambitions in order to avoid Prigozhin's fate, the Institute emphasized. And to wrap up the report, the evening update by the General Staff of Ukraine. The Russian aggressor continues to focus his main efforts on conducting offensive actions in the Liman, Bakhmut, Avdiivka, Marinka, and Shachtarske directions and does not stop trying to enter the administrative border of Donetsk and Luhansk oblasts. In the Kupiansk and Liman directions, the enemy is making attempts to break through the defense of our troops. He led unsuccessful offensives in the direction of Yanikivka, Masyutivka, Nevske, Sebryansk Forest, Bilohorivka, and Verkhnokamianske. In the direction of Bakhmut, the enemy does not stop trying to capture the city of Bakhmut. Enemy attacks were repulsed in the areas of Orihovo-Vasilivka, Khiorivka, Chasivya, Ivanivske settlements. Battles continue in Bakhmut. In the Avdiivka, Marinka, and Shachtarske directions, the enemy carried out unsuccessful offensive actions in the direction of Kamianka, Avdiivka, Siverne, Pervomaiske, and Marinka. The enemy is defending in the Zaporizhzhia and Kherson directions. The enemy continues to suffer losses. Thus, 150 mercenaries of the so-called Wagner PMC were brought to the territory of the Bilovodsk district hospital in the temporarily occupied territory of the Luhansk Oblast for treatment. In the city of Enerhoda, temporarily occupied by Russia, at the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant, the shortage of skilled workers who can ensure the vital activity of the nuclear power plant is growing catastrophically. After the Russian occupiers employed people without the appropriate education and experience at the nuclear power plant, the contract term of the Russian representatives of Rosatom expired. At the same time, they were refused to sign a new or extend an existing contract. They also refused to return to Russia, since there is no one in particular to work at the nuclear power plant. All this can lead to unpredictable consequences. And that wraps up the report. Should you be interested in details, you can find links to every article I mentioned in the description as usual. If you enjoyed the report and found it informative, please consider sharing it with others and giving me a like. I hope you will join me again tomorrow. Thank you for tuning in and have a great day. You were listening to The Account. Slava Ukraini.